101, so we're going to begin, and today I will do the opening karakia. Kia tūturu tātou, kia manaki tātou, ki whaihiranga tātou, kia tūhonohono tātou, whānau, whānau, haramai te toki, haumie huie taikie. The translation is let's be real, let's be caring, let's pursue excellence, let's connect. Join together and affirm our agreement. We are united in purpose and ready to proceed. So we shall be ready to proceed. There is no public forum, and I have apologies from Councillor Steve Walker and Councillor Marie Lefiso, and for lateness from Matapura Ellison and Megan Porticky. So I will move that the committee accepts the apologies. Is there a seconder? Thank you, Councillor Gilbert. Put the motion. All those in favour say aye. Anyone against? Abstentions? That is carried. Confirmation of agenda. I'll move that the committee confirm. Nobody has any alterations or additions. I'll move that the committee confirms the agenda without alteration or addition. Is there a seconder? Thank you, Councillor Wiley. I'm going to put the motion. All those in favour say aye. Aye. Anyone against? Abstentions? That is carried. Declarations of interest. Members are reminded of the need to stand aside from decision making when a conflict arose between their role as an elected representative and any private or other external interests they might have. Are there any changes or updates? There being none, I move that the committee notes the elected members' interest register attached as attachment A and confirms the proposed management plan for elected members' interests. May I have a seconder? Thank you, Councillor Gilbert. I'm going to put the motion. All those in favour say aye. Aye. Anyone against? Abstentions? That is carried. Confirmation of minutes. So we have minutes from the Strategy Planning and Engagement Committee meeting 19th of June 2023. Does anyone have any updates or comments? Therefore, I shall move that the committee confirms the minutes of the Strategy Planning and Engagement Committee meeting held on the 19th of June 2023 as a correct record. May I have a seconder, please? Thank you, Councillor O'Malley. All those in favour say aye. Aye. Anyone against? Abstentions? That is carried. Which brings us to Part A, reports. The Forward Work Programme, and I invite Mr West or Ms Moran to speak to the report.
I only have one thing that I just want to point out, standing in for Ms Wakira this afternoon. The review of the strategic framework on page 23, first one on your forward work programme. I think there's going to be a change. I think we won't be presenting that to the spec meeting in September, and I'll advise of an alternative date as soon as I can. But apart from that, happy to take questions and to try and answer them.
I have a question first of all, just about the Botanic Garden strategic plan, and I just wondered if anyone's able to give an update on that. There may not be anyone here that's able to do that.
No, I can't, unfortunately, Councillor, but we will ask the Parks team.
If it could be followed up, that would be good, thank you. Councillor Gary, have a question?
Yes, it's on page 26, the Otago Boat Harbour Reserve Management Plan and Otago Harbour Reserve Management Plan. Can I ask how that work relates or will relate to a wider piece of work being done around the harbour? Will those two things be done in parallel? I mean, this is just the start of the process, I see.
I'm going to have to apologise to you as well, Councillor. I can't answer that question, and what I will do is I'll get the Group Manager from Parks to circulate that answer to all of you in the next few days.
So, any other questions? Okay, I will move the resolution that the committee notes the Strategy Planning and Engagement Committee Forward Work Programme is shown in attachment A. May I have a seconder, please? Thank you, Councillor Lucas. Would anyone like to speak to the motion? So therefore I shall put the motion. All those in favour say aye. Aye. Anyone against? Abstentions? That is carried. Right, we shall move on to the Residents' Opinion Survey Quarterly Update, April to June 2023 quarter. Ms Huako will speak to the report. Ms. Sorry. And John.
Kia ora koutou. I take it that the report is read, and so we're just happy to proceed to questions if that's okay with the Chair.
Thank you. I have one question, and perhaps I haven't read it completely thorough. I just wondered what the margin of error was in the quarterly ROS surveys.
We are still waiting to receive the final figure on the margin of error, but typically it's around the 2.5 to 2.7%.
Thank you.
And in a week's time we should receive a confirmation. Yeah.
Great, thank you. Councillor Benson-Pope, you have a question?
I do. Thank you, Madam Chair. My question's about paragraph 17 and 18, where you highlight the only statistically significant change, and you make the assumption that relates to the work being completed in that first block of George Street. You're happy that that's an accurate assumption as much as you can base it on fact?
You would see we use careful wording there, and it is speculation, so it is a best guess around what's before us. We also were able to read some of the commentary that we've got in that last quarter, so there was, I believe, around 10 comments that were quite positive and 2 that were sort of more on the negative side.
You talk about that in paragraph 18 of the 50 comments. 20% specifically commented on George Street.
Correct.
And 4% had the opposite view.
Yes, and in actual numbers there were 2 comments there. One was more generalist, like not very happy with what's happening in the kind of roadwork area, and one was more specific to George Street.
And a further question that leads from the roadwork issue, given in the wider context, the enabling work in particular has caused a bit of grief and delay, inevitably. Is there anything else in the survey that specifically points at that? I mean, given that context, I would have thought that's a very good result indeed. Is there anything else anywhere in the survey that showed that level of dissatisfaction that we sort of seen in the media, but it certainly doesn't show here?
I think we just have to read the survey in its context, and that it is a quarterly sample, and there are some indicators. There are indicators that there is an increase in satisfaction in that one area. I'm not sure how wide we can speculate in a more general terms, but that's what we'll get when we do the final year's results.
Thank you. I'm happy to move in due course, Madam Chair.
Councillor Gilbert has indicated he wishes to move. Did you have some questions, Councillor Gilbert?
Yes, I did. Thank you. First of all, thank you. It's great to be able to see up-to-date information. First question is, what classifies as statistically significant changes?
So in this residents' opinion survey, we use this the confidence interval at 95%, which means it's the way to describe probability. So by constructing confidence interval at 95%, we are confident that the 95 times out of 100 times, if we were to redo the sampling in exact same way, we will see the same result.
So what I mean is, as Councillor Benson-Pope has just pointed out, at number 17, you say the only statistically significant change found was the satisfaction and the overall city development. But I would suggest that perhaps an increase of 43% from starting point of, for example, the performance of community board members. That's, whilst the number isn't high, a 43% change is quite significant. I would even suggest that a 21% increase from starting point on the waste management is also statistically significant. So I'm just wondering at what how much of a change from its original number is classified as statistically significant?
Maybe just to comment, I'll ask a question as well. It isn't our staff that determine whether there's a statistical significance, is that correct? It's the actual company. So it's the company that determines whether there's a significant difference, and they'll base that on their magic statistical science.
Yes, that is correct.
Do you want to answer Councillor Gilbert's question?
So far, I'm just community or
Does anyone else have any more questions?
starting point.
Okay, thank you. And you've indicated that you wish to move.
The number of people. It's the number of people in the cohort that determines statistical significance as well, isn't it?
What? Yeah. Councillor Gilbert, which figure or result were you referring to again, please? The community board.
Yeah, both the community board, which by my maths, going from 30% to 43% satisfaction is an increase of approximately 43%.
So in this quarterly report, it's a quarter-on-quarter comparison. So 43% is compared to 36% in the previous quarter. So in terms of the increases, we are looking at 36 to 43 instead of 30 to 43, if that makes sense.
And can I just comment that these are distinct quarterly reports. That statistic potential significance that you're talking about will show up in the annual report, where we get to look at a much longer period of data. So I hope that clarifies that question.
Right, I will second the motion now. I think everyone has finished questions, haven't they? So Councillor Gilbert, would you like to?
Just very briefly, again, I want to reiterate my thanks. I know it was a bit of a grumble when I postulated or put forward the idea of having quarterly updates. And I just want to say again, thank you very much. Having regular and being able to track regular and up-to-date data gives us a lot more to work with, so it's greatly appreciated. And I just want to point out as well that this is the first one, and it's from here that we actually start to get some traction, and it's the longer we keep this going, the more information we have and the more accurate our data is, and the more we can see trends and react to them.
Councillor Benson-Pope.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I think we should be welcoming these figures, especially the one that I highlighted earlier, because they are a vindication of the work that Council committed to, and more importantly than that, in the context of a lot of quite disruptive work that had to happen for other reasons that we're only too familiar with. There are testimonies to the good work that our staff, particularly Dr. Hazelton and his team, have done around all the enabling works, the PR, the advertising on the back of buses that tell people to go and shop and show some love, and all that also in the context of some pretty grotty winter weather. So I think we should all be heartened by the public response that is obvious, not only in anecdotal comment but in this trend, and I'm sure it will continue strongly as we see the other quarters, as the other blocks are revealed, shall we say.
Councillor Wiley.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I too want to thank for this quarterly report, and thank Councillor Gilbert for pushing this through, because I think it does give us a very good snapshot through to April to June. But more importantly, I think it's a very good way to visually see what is happening around the city and how our residents are viewing what's happening at council, and I think that is important. I would just like to basically push everybody that it gets the invite to be part of the consultation, the reporting to the Residents' Opinion Survey, to actually involve themselves in it, because their voices do matter. Thank you.
I just want to comment that I was in support of the ROS, and I also love a good trend. And when we look at what was happening a year ago, there are some things that are quite statistically significant. We look at the water-related infrastructure. This is from April-June 2022 to April-June 2023. So actually comparing the year's figures, and we can see there's an 8% increase in satisfaction in that, 11% increase in satisfaction on waste management, an 11% increase in planning and urban design, 7% increase overall with satisfaction in the DCC, 10% increase with facilities, infrastructure and services. I guess a little bow to us, 9% increase in satisfaction with the performance of mayor and councillors, and a 13% increase with the satisfaction and performance of the community boards. So as well as looking at that last quarter, I think it's really important to look at the year in the time, because sometimes we get a bit of seasonal affective disorder as well. So I think that's quite useful to look back. And I'll hand over. Do you want to use your right of reply, Councillor Gilbert? Oh, sorry, Councillor Gary.
Thank you. And it would be unsurprising, I think, to all of us that the planning and urban design showed a statistically significant improvement. It doesn't come as a surprise, because I know I've certainly had lots of feedback out in the community, and I'm sure others around this table have, as people have been able to visualise the planning that has been going on for so long to deliver the beginning of the changes to George Street. And I think it would be very remiss of us not to acknowledge the work of the previous council and the leadership of Mayor Hawkins in that work. In that initial period, there was a lot of disruption and criticism of the work, but now that people have seen it, we've seen that reflected, and it will be this council that will receive credit, and you've seen the lift in the stats around that, and that's not surprising either. But it is good to see that people have acknowledged and seen that change. It will be interesting to see the quarterly reporting next time, and for us to be able to see overall the changes.
Just very briefly, right of reply. As Councillor Wiley pointed out, it's fantastic to be able to see what our residents are actually thinking, and given our role is that of the voice of the residents, hearing actually what they have to say is highly important. For example, in the communications section, which I've currently just lost, I did have it on here, the communication channels at 57%, which some could argue isn't that bad. I would suggest that we've still got quite some way to go, and being able to see what people are thinking at the time, or more or less, means that the communication channels are far more specific and trackable rather than just anecdotal, as we all have. As Councillor Gary has pointed out, we all talk to members of the public. This is a way of actually putting it down on paper, in figures, in numbers, and be able to track it over time.
Thank you. I'm going to put the motion. All those in favour say aye. Those against? Abstentions? That is carried. Now we will move on to the South Dunedin Future Programme update, and I welcome Mr Rob West and Mr Jonathan Rowe to speak to the report. Oh, sorry, Simon. Had on my notes that it was going to be Rob. You've got to escape. Welcome, gentlemen. Have you got any comments to preface it, or are we taking it as read? Go for it.
Thank you, Chair. So I'll take the paper as read, but just in terms of a few framing comments. The last time we were back here formally in front of Council was July last year, when the former Council signed off the program plan. So in that sort of preceding 12 months, basically after outlining how we thought the program would run and how we would implement it, we spent the next 12 months kind of figuring out how we would do that. And then kind of the last 6, as is the case in sort of public sector spaces, procuring kind of the resources that we think we need to help us do that. So we've just crossed quite a big kind of threshold there in terms of getting a big external consultant team on deck. We're about to sort of push go on this next phase of the program, this plan building phase. But kind of the key message I'd like to share there is that after a period of a lot of talk and, observations about, there's lots of talk, when are we going to see some action, the program's about to accelerate and accelerate very quickly. So I think we're going to start producing products at a sort of quarterly pace. You're probably going to be sick the sight of me this time in a year's time, because we'll be back several times for decisions on some quite chunky issues. So what the report's really about is capturing some of that, recording what we've done in the last 12 months, and then sort of foreshadowing some of the big ticket things coming forward in the next 6 to 12. Thank you.
Councillor Benson-Pope, you have a question?
Thank you. Last time you spoke to us, we were all very interested in that pin map of the property transaction movement. Is that work ongoing to keep monitoring what's happening, or whether that trend is continuing?
Yes, so the conversations around sort of the emerging information that we'll get from this program about kind of risk and what that looks like in South D, the current rate of consent approvals and kind of building of townhouses, that's an active discussion internally across a number of different groups. We're monitoring it, and you'd appreciate it's quite a big machine to sort of turn around or redirect or put on hold. But the idea is that the program will inform a whole number of other departments within DCC that can then factor that into their decision making, for example, around issuing consents.
I have a question around the effectiveness in comms and engagement, given that we've just had our residents' opinion survey. Does the residents' opinion survey get broken down so we could understand if people from South Dunedin were feeling like they were communicated and engaged with enough?
Councillor, I might have to glance at my colleagues.
Yeah.
It doesn't appear to be broken down.
So how do you measure whether you're actually achieving cut-through in South Dunedin with all of the community, so they feel like they're being taken on the journey? Because there's a lot of work being put in. But how is it measured?
Sure. At the moment, we're capturing metrics around who we're meeting with, how often we're meeting, how many people we're meeting with. We're also capturing things like website hits. We've got an inbox that's sort of an all a program inbox, if you like, South Dunedin Future at DCC, which we can obviously track that. But it's something we'll be working up. One of the key things that the consultant team that's coming on board is going to help us with is finalising a comms and engagement plan. That'll include sort of an analytics piece around tracking that, so that, just as you've pointed out, we can kind of track trends and monitor that. But there's also going to be an extensive part of the program that's sort of front-facing engagement. So we feel we have a pretty good read on a lot of the community, because we are meeting with a lot of stakeholders regularly, and certainly when they're not happy, they let us know.
Thank you. Just very quickly, which is ironic given the topic of my question, speed. I know we're talking about, I think it's, where is it, number 6, we're talking about the SDF program accelerating and trying to get things done in a rapid process, and in item 7 it's that the adaptation strategy will be completed by mid-2026, or at least that's the anticipation. Climate change isn't stopping, and it doesn't appear to be slowing down. What happens? Do we think this is going to be fast enough? Part A. Part B, if it's not, do we have a contingency to match if climate change overtakes us?
Councillor, I might just seek a point of clarification and then answer both sides. So there's a conversation around timing around production of the strategy, so over the next 3 years, and then there's another one around sort of whatever we produce in the strategy, is that going to be fast enough to react? Okay. So in the first piece, the big output from the program is going to be the strategy, right? That's the bit that pulls it all together in 3 years' time. However, in the intervening period, we're going to have a whole series of products, so 3 different stages of a risk assessment. We'll have a whole lot of community engagement work. There's that 5-stage adaptation options development. Each of those will have a product and a report, sort of visuals, which will start to give people a flavour of where's this trending, what is this starting to look like. So what I would expect both sort of internal stakeholders, that's all my colleagues that do the planning, the Three Waters, etc., they will be able to look at these products and start to factor that into their planning, their budgeting, their strategy. Similarly, anyone that is thinking about buying a home in South D will be able to start looking at these things, thinking about developing, saying, right, what is that landscape starting to look like? The councils at DCC and ORC are starting to quantify the hazards, so we know not just that there's a groundwater issue, but what does that look like in the next 10, 20, 40 years? What areas are sort of slightly worse than others? That's the kind of space we're going to move into. There is a residual risk around, are we continuing to make decisions while we're developing that information over the next 3 years that we're going to look at in 3 years' time and regret? That's just part and parcel of the trade-offs and making judgments about. And the whole part of the program is really around how do we give the people around this table and ORC table the best possible information in terms of being really technically robust, well engaged with the community, and that it's all sort of coherent and makes sense and have been weighed off about a bunch of trade-offs, so that when we put it to you, you know it's kind of the best available, and that's as good as we can do. Obviously, in the longer term piece, uncertainty is a massive challenge, right? Anyone that looks at the emissions curves or the sea level rise curves knows the big divergence in that. So we're kind of, we're planning for some pretty scary scenarios, but at the same time, there's a risk of overshooting, over-responding, and overreacting. So we will be constantly making judgments ourselves. We'll be constantly, in the advice we're putting forward, trying to explain, this is what we've said, but there's a range, so it's based on our best judgments. But a lot of the work that we're looking at is very long term, slow burn. If you're putting a piece of infrastructure in the ground now, it really needs to still be working in 60 or 80 years for that to pay off. So we have to be factoring these into our decisions. And we are, that's absolutely the case, but it's tricky, right? I think, has that answered you?
Sort of, but if we don't keep up with climate change, do we have we can just quickly jump over to here. I mean, this is the ideal. We're going to have, this is our long term, etc. If we no longer have long term, then we have this, which isn't our ideal, but it's what we now have to work with.
Yes, so part of in the back of the report, there's a reference to sort of some early thinking about land use change. So the technical program is going to produce this adaptation strategy. It's got a whole lot of technical work that kind of says what's going to happen when, what do people think about that, and what can we do about it. Then we've got to make a decision around, well, how would you implement that? And that's that early work that's looking at, well, how if you needed to do a whole lot of land use change, how would you do that? What we've done is the initial work is looking at that. If you had to do that over a period of 100 years, 1% land use change a year, there's 6,500 properties in South Dunedin. Public ownership is about 300, so there's about 6,200, 62 properties a year in public ownership, private ownership. What would that look like year on year? How would you do that? There's absolutely an expectation that wouldn't be linear, that change. So we are going to need to think about, if we get a big event or it turns out that things are moving faster, do we have some redundancy in the system? Have we got ahead of this? Do we have some plan Bs around if we get an Auckland anniversary type flood? What do we do then? So there is a piece of this that I think will probably be an offshoot of the program where if we get an event that none of us want, and that requires a big decision about how do we build back, or do we build back, that's probably where the big decisions will come around, kind of catching up, and are we going fast enough? But it's all in the mix.
Councillor Gary?
I was going to say asked and answered, because that was the question I was going to ask, but I've got a subsequent one, listening very carefully to your response. So I think for many of us, the global events around the world that have happened because of climate change, and most recently the wildfires in Hawaii, are catastrophic events. How would that change the thinking in the community, do you think? Would it derail it? My sense is that it would focus people very clearly, and we've seen that happen to some degree from Cyclone Gabrielle in terms of people's thinking. The third time they've been flooded, it's like a light bulb moment and a hard one to experience. What is your comment around that? In terms of the adaptive pathway, how that kind of event would impact on people's thinking and willingness to think differently or consider more impactful, significant changes?
Thank you, Councillor. A little bit difficult at this point to sort of speak on behalf of the communities, but I would say our impression is that just nationally, the conversation about adaptation has moved on enormously since the events in Auckland and Cyclone Gabrielle in general. It's a big risk for the program in terms of if we got another 2015 style flood, what would that mean? What would that do to our relationships? What would that do to the kind of mandate of the program? A little bit difficult to forecast that, but I think the standard response is that we need to be doing everything we can to mitigate short-term flood risks, so that if an event like that happens, that the impact is minimised. We need to have really good emergency response systems. Similarly, I guess the bit that we have now that we didn't have in 2015 is we've got a plan, we've got a long-term plan and a process for stepping this through, which the intent of that is to give people confidence. And I think it's very likely that we will get another event at some point in the future, whether that's in the next 2 years, 20 years, I'm not sure. And it also sort of, I guess, lends weight to Councillor Gilbert's comment around, how do we know we're going fast enough? And I think the answer to that is we just need to go as fast as we possibly can, because even getting ahead of this thing, we might get an event like Auckland where, all of a sudden we go from thinking we're ahead to being behind. And we need to find, a solution for several hundred houses that we thought were okay and it turns out are now.
You didn't mention the rain radar. That's a change too. So have you seen, in the time you've been involved with the project, have you seen a shift in the community's perspective? And
absolutely. So I think last Friday, I've been in the role for 2 years. My colleague Ian's been almost 4, and I think he would, don't want to speak on his path, but I think absolutely have seen a change in the community. Partly that reflects, when I came in, one of the things Ian said to me was that we've talked about the problems enough. People are ready to talk about what next and what does that look like. So what do we do about this? So that's basically the last 2 years has been around how do you go from this is the problem to what can we do about it? So that's been putting this architecture in place, getting the contractors on board, figuring out kind of how do you balance the science, the kind of people bit, and then sort of the decision making around what we do about all of that. So we've got that structure in place, and now we just need to basically play it out. We've got 3 years to let that process run, and then this time in 3 years we should be in a space to make much more informed decisions. We might not like what it says. It might ask us to make really difficult decisions, but at least they'll be based on the best possible info.
thank you.
Right, have a wee bit of a line-up. Councillor O'Malley, Mayor Raddick, Councillor Wiley, and then Councillor Houlihan. Councillor O'Malley.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I've got an old question from a long time ago, and that's there was budgeted, I think, for 2025 or 2026, a 3 waters program for basically effectively cutting the floodplain in half and doing a pumping operation. My question to this is, it then got pushed back for a network. I'm just going to look at Mr. Drew here for it. Basically, a clearer understanding of our network operations in the city in general, and a hydraulic model of what's going on in that area, right? How wrong could it go versus if we have a 2015 event and we haven't done anything by 2026, and we had originally promised that we would have put some stuff in by 2025? I presume that the issue is we're worried about stranded assets and putting investment in the wrong place and not getting the outcome. But on the other side of that would be if you haven't done any work and then you need to do the work, you're already now way further back in time than you were before. to what extent are we balancing the ability to have something in place versus the worry that we'll overinvest? Or could we even put in, I mean, do we generally have to worry about we putting in something wrong?
I think you said, what's the worst that could happen? Geez, where could I go with that? And often New Zealand infrastructure has been put into reactions without kind of good, solid thinking behind it. One of the things that has been discussed, cutting the catchment in half and putting a water body there. I guess one of the worst things that would happen is that increases the risk of liquefaction in the area, and we would have an earthquake similar to Christchurch, that you would make the surrounding areas worse. Understanding all your natural hazards and risks is important, that we don't put in something that has the potential to make things worse. But it is a real difficult balance between planning and doing, and it's something I've wrestled with personally through the entire program. And I think New Zealand has a history of reacting, not planning. If we think to just Auckland as an example, if the city planners of Auckland had considered at one point in the future it'll be a 2 million population city, and we'd thought about public transport and corridors for light rail, and all of that had been incorporated into the planning way back 20, 30 years ago, we wouldn't be trying to shoehorn in infrastructure into a built-up city. And so that is the conundrum, I guess, for planners and professionals. How long do we plan versus how long do we do? I think we've kind of got this balance about right. We could go faster, but it takes more kind of effort to go faster.
I'll go to, so 12B is strategy and program, and it's got the feed out that, strategy and program, developing a clear strategic intent and designing blah, blah, blah. And then go down to point 37, and it's 2026. Now, in 2026, when we've come out with the plan, will we then be going out for the funding to execute the plan at that point, or will we have already started activities by that point? My point here being, I know full well that once you decide to do something, it's still another 5 years before you do it, so that's 2031. So are we folding in any activities that are going out? I know we've procured our external advisors, but is anything coming out in front of this before 2026?
Councillor, I might speak on behalf of the program. So it's a little bit goes to those interim outputs. So that this that A3, was A3, that shows kind of what product will be produced sort of between now and 2026. As I said, each time we produce one of those, so anything we produce between now and October, when we do the long-term planning and budgeting process for the next triennium, we would expect the Three Waters team to be factoring that into decisions they're making about investments over the next 3 years. So we would absolutely expect to be shaping in a positive way and informing in a positive way any investments that are going to be planned and budgeted for the next 3 years. So by the time the final strategy comes out in mid-2026, there's already stuff happening on the ground that's going to be implementing elements of that. It will be just be based on earlier stage thinking.
Which will have to be in this long-term plan.
Yeah, it's my expectation that it'll all happen in parallel. And we need to think about how, if there are land use planning changes, how the infrastructure supports those changes. So it'll be iterative and in parallel would be my expectation.
Okay, thanks. And then just a much more minor question. Point 27, you're talking about working with the School of Surveying to look at vertical lab movements. Are you working with LINS as well?
I would have to double check with ORC on the specifics of who they're working with. Yeah, I'd have to come back to you on that.
And The reason for that is that LINZ have been heavily involved in land shape changes that have occurred after Cyclone Gabrielle and with their LiDAR services, which I assume is basically what we'll be doing, is it not? It gets back to my other question. I guess I'll go straight into it. GNS has been a player here for a long time, but I've often seen them acting almost by themselves and then bringing their stuff across. And I don't see an integrated work with GNS in this report either. I assume there is, though, or how are you working with them?
Yep, and GNS have been central to all of this work and will continue to be. I think that's the expectation. So the just in terms of specifics, so there's 5 work streams across the program. The first one on that sheet is natural hazards, which is led by ORC. They have a couple of existing contracts with GNS to support a whole range of scientific work, particularly groundwater modelling. That, if you think about that as being one of the primary inputs into the other 4 work streams that are sort of led by DCC that we've just procured. So all of the GNS work to date, current work that they're contracted to do, and I would imagine future work will be drawn into the program.
Miretta?
Yes, we got. My question is very similar to Councillor Manley's actually, but just looking back historically to frame it up, 2011 there was an OPIS report with a whole lot of recommendations, including removal of a lot of constrictions in the system for flood protection for South Dunedin. And of course we had a flood in 2015 and none of the recommendations of the 11 report had been implemented as far as I can see. And then we are now at this stage, 2023, and we have done some things, but not all. And the 4th bit of information is that the majority of people in South Dunedin, we do know, want to stay there, if at all possible. And this long-term South Dunedin future is really about a long-term effect, and so we're making plans for bigger rainfall events and worse situations. So that's good to have that long-term planning. So my question is this: what set of immediate or very short-term strategies are we working on, and perhaps have we already implemented? So we're on the list of things that we've done. Is there a list? So we will have a list of things that we've done. Have we got a similar list of things that we are doing right now, this year, next year, and the year after, in the next 3 years, that will protect South Dunedin from a 2015 flood? And I think it's probably a bit much to expect that we're going to be protected from maybe a Auckland flood, which was twice as big as what we've had here. But, we did have a flood in 1968, which was bigger than the 2015 flood. So, we need to be mindful of all of that. So have we got a list of short-term strategies that are going to be effective? Because I think that the people of South Dunedin would be reassured by knowing that this stuff has been done, here's the list, and this stuff is being done right now, next year and the year after. Do we have that?
Thank you, Mr. Spear. So the South Dunedin Future Program is a long-term play, if you like. So we're looking at sort of 5, 10, 30, 100 years out. We're very interested in the work that's going on in the next sort of 1, 2 and 3 years, obviously, because that affects what happens day to day. But that work is typically led by our colleagues across different parts of the organisation. So I might ask Mr. Drew to respond to sort of what specific flood work is planned for the next 3 years.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. So yes, there is a list. I'll just mention a couple, for example, but we can get you a more detailed list with time. But there's been changes to the Portobello stormwater pump station. There's been improved jetting and cleaning of the pipelines in South Dunedin, so making sure that they're clear and not blocked. There's been improvements to the way mud tanks are cleaned and monitored. All those kind of infrastructure fixes that we could do to create additional capacity. All the quick wins, if you like, have been done, and now we're largely in the planning. So the detailed hydraulic models. We have a whole lot of monitoring equipment in the network that are picking up rainfall events and showing how the pipes in the system are reacting, and that can feed back into the model so that the model is an accurate representation of what's there on the ground, and then we can start using that as a tool to inform future investment decisions. But I guess, and this is to Councillor O'Malley and Councillor Gilbert's, how fast do you go? If there are, some of the things that have been talked about are land use planning changes. The infrastructure needs to understand what they might be, because if we are creating more intensity in some areas and de-intensifying other areas, that means bigger pipes in some places and smaller pipes in others. So there's a bit of detail to fill in so that we have the right infrastructure in the right places that support the long-term strategy. There's probably enough in there to start digging up and putting pipes there now, but I couldn't guarantee you that's the right investment 20 years from now, as South Dunedin starts to kind of change. But we can bring those conversations to you. It's just there is a risk that we put the wrong pipes in the wrong place. If we go too early, that doesn't support the 50, 80-year vision, and that's the balancing act that we're in at the moment.
Councillor Wiley.
Thank you. Just adding on to that, and it's not my main question, but Mr. Drew, would the use of lawyer's head pipe be another positive advantage versus the 215 South Dunedin flood when that was never used?
I wouldn't call it positive, but it is a response that we use. So as Mr. Rowe mentioned before, our emergency response procedures have come a long way since 2015, and we're proactive about getting sandbags out into the network and doing all the normal cleaning and sweeping, and using lawyer's head as a proactive response that we use to minimise flooding of properties. It's not something we like to do because there is a risk of kind of environmental issues associated with it, but it is a tool that we have available if we need it.
Thank you. Yeah, I think proactive is a far better word than positive, so appreciate that. Mr. Rowe, looking at point 17 of our papers, and I pick up on words, South Dunedin must be protected from climate change at all costs until everyone has to leave. And then further down, manage risks and make South Dunedin safer, but also support activities, e.g. urban regeneration, that make South Dunedin a better place to live. And a part of that, I also look on page 48, the pamphlet to residents, which is actually really good in informing them. So I hope they've taken the time to read that. But my question is, and it carries on from questions I've asked you previously, I still don't see anywhere where you're talking to the real estate agents on about the market in South Dunedin. And I've spent a bit of time following that up after previous questions I've asked you at council. And yet property owners, and some that I've spoken to, are quite frustrated in feeling that their community, as much as things are going to happen, and again, I'll use the word positive in a positive way in acknowledgement of how we adapt South Dunedin, but they're concerned about their property values versus the other parts of Dunedin. And what's also come about in talking to quite a few, a lot of the new residents to our city seem to buy property in South Dunedin, not knowing the issues. And I think that's a challenge that I've heard from about 3 or 4 people who came to Dunedin for jobs, end up buying property, and they go, oh my God, we bought in South Dunedin. And I'm trying to get a more positive narrative for those property owners in South Dunedin and engagement with the real estate agents. Can you give me any feedback on that, and have you spent any time talking to those in the real estate industry?
We have, among the many groups in the community we've spoken to, obviously lots of different property owners, some of whom have expressed similar views to what you've just shared. We have met with the South Dunedin Otago Property Investors Association is one of the groups, for example, that we've met with. It's obviously a big factor, right? I think part of this is enabling people to make informed decisions. So that this is where the work on the natural hazards piece comes in. So what do these hazards look like? How are they going to change over time? What's the actual risk? Which allows people who are making investment decisions to exercise their own judgments. Some people might be very risk tolerant and be happy to invest, others less so and make different decisions. So there's an element of kind of not telling people what to do, but just giving them the information and then they can make their own decision. There's another bit around the narrative about this thing has been this sort of binary black and white deficit model of, South Dunedin doesn't have a future and we just need to dig it as long as we can, hold on as long as we can, and then we're going to all have to leave because the water's going to come in. We don't think that that's the right narrative, nor do we think that that's the case. This is going to be an incremental thing, and we think that while we absolutely expect there's a need for a lot of change. The only thing I'm sure of is that South Dunedin probably won't look the way it does now in 50 years' time. I don't know what it's going to look like, but I think change is inevitable. Just like South Dunedin has looked very different. If you jump back in time 50 years, it's gone through a number of different iterations. What we've recognised, we want people to recognise in that change, there's enormous opportunity. So there's an opportunity to make it not just safer, as I say, with sort of better infrastructure, but you can also move people out of harm's way. We can create green and blue space. We can create better transport, better housing. You can plan this in a way where we look at this in 50 years' time and think, yes, climate change was a catalyst for this, and it's caused a lot of issues, but overall we're probably all in a better space than we were back in 2023 because, now we've got less exposure to flood, despite that flood risk being higher, or the impacts potentially being higher. We've got better quality housing, we've got more green and blue space, we've got more transport networks, we're sort of more, our housing is better quality and maybe hubbed around, transport hubs and things. So what we want people to recognise is that there is a positive narrative and a positive future and trajectory for South D, and it's not all doom and gloom. But there are big challenges and we need to kind of recognise what they are and kind of grip them up and then plan for a way forward.
So if the principals from the likes of Bailey's Real Estate, Cutlers, LJ Hooker, Ray White or NID reached out to you, would you go and meet them and their agents to give them a presentation on what is South Dunedin's looking like going forward?
Oh, absolutely. And I think it's important to recognise that while we've been having lots and lots of conversations with lots of parts of the community, one of the gaps I think we've got is probably in that private sector space where we don't have the connections. They're not as good as maybe in the community sector. When we have, I think part of that's when we have spoken to private sector interests in the past. Time is money, and they want. If we've got something concrete to show them or tell them what's going to change and when, and they will make their own decisions about that. They're really keen to talk to us, but we've typically had to say, look, there's this big program we're doing. It's going to be 5 years, and we're going to have something in 18 months' time. The general response has been, hey, sounds interesting. Come back and talk to us in 18 months' time. So we expect that we will have something that will interest everyone, including private sector, very soon. In fact, we've got a natural hazards product that we'll be putting out in the next couple of weeks that looks to sort of summarise a whole lot of that. But you're very, very keen to connect to those groups. So if you've got names and email addresses, I'll come and grab you afterwards.
Councillor Houlihan, then Councillor O'Malley.
Thank you. One of the pressure points, I think in the 2015 floods, but I could be wrong, but I think was around Kaikorai and coming down through that queue area in Surrey Street, and there was infrastructure work being done in that area. Where are we at with that, please? And if following on from that, if we had another 2015 flood, would that area be equipped to deal with that?
Surrey Street is still a risk. So Surrey Street, all of the private property pipes in Surrey Street, they're a low point, have had non-return valves put on their pipes, so effectively the water can't go back up into the houses. So those properties would fare better than they did in 2015, but it's still a pinch point in the network. There was a whole lot of work done in about 2021 from memory, looking at an overflow into the Kaikorai stream, but that ended up with a $15 million treatment solution for something that was temporary. So it's still caught up in what is the bigger, longer term solution for South Dunedin.
Thank you. In the report, it's got that the government is obviously one of the stakeholder groups, along with mana whenua and local government, of course, ourselves and other ones. What conversations to this point, or even assurances, have we had from the government around anything to do with South Dunedin? Are there any assurances on obviously money, or like have had a previous conversation around the sales of over the time of houses? You talked about that at another date and showed it became very clear that the sale is sort of meeting that number of housing naturally, the ones that come and go. And is that a conversation or a line of conversation that you're having with the government?
Yes. Yep. So we're having pretty active conversations with a number of central government parties, so Ministry for Environment, the Treasury, and one or two others. So as I think I've said before, this isn't really active conversation nationally. There's the whole RMA reform piece that is going to produce the Climate Adaptation Act. Everyone's sort of watching what's going to happen with the government's response to Auckland and the Tairāwhiti and Cyclone Gabriel regions around who pays for what. It's obviously potential to set precedents around what we do down here. But I think the expectation is with the change that is on the table over the coming century, it's unlikely that that could be resourced just from local government resources. So I think this is absolutely a conversation for central government as well.
Exactly. And so just to clarify, are some of the conversations you've had with government suggesting that when places come up for sale in South Dunedin, that maybe government considers looking at purchasing some of those properties to have a future plan around that, or is that going too far?
It's early days. I think we haven't got to that level of detail yet. But there is a government contribution to the program, and obviously we would be wanting to have more detailed discussions with government once we've got a few more metrics from.
But in the future, do you see that as a possibility?
I think so.
Councillor O'Malley.
Madam Chair, just back to stranded assets. Would it be fair to say that a pipe in the ground should be given like an asset value lifespan of around about 75 years?
Yep.
25 years, you're 33% of or 1/3 of the way through the lifespan return on that pipe.
Fair.
Which I'll bring up in my speeches then in terms of stranded assets and the extent to which are we worried about trying to get 100% return on our asset, or are we trying to get an outcome where we had did we have $20 million with the damage in the 2015 flood? Well, I think it was 12 was the bottom number and it was like 100 was the top number. That's in the report, isn't it? Sorry, I did that. No. Right, so I'll touch it in my speech. Cool. Thank you.
Does anyone else have any more questions? Councillor O'Malley, you've indicated that you would like to move. Do we have a seconder? Councillor Mayhem.
Thank you, Madam Chair. listen, I'm really happy to receive this report, and I'm glad to see the way the team is moving. You would have seen questions, though, around the between planning and action, and I think that we need to always keep that in the back of our heads. We couldn't plan to make sure that we make no mistakes, but the consequences of planning for that long without action can actually result in unforeseen circumstances themselves, where we end up not preparing ourselves for the next event. It was encouraging to see in, I think, point 39 that the mention of 100 years planning would imply that our planning head is now setting towards the idea of, in fact, we do plan on being in South Dunedin in 100 years' time. I think we can fairly safely say that we've put to bed the idea that we're all going to leave, as was unfortunately said right after the floods in 2015. But what we're going to do to stay is going to be complex. My only feedback really is I think we have to accept the idea that we could end up with stranded assets as we come through this in the process of trying to do the right outcome. And we will have to always balance protecting the community in the immediate with trying to make sure that we don't overspend and do something wrong in the long term. And I'm convinced myself, having been in this environment in technology in the past, there are certain things you can do and you can start on long before that you put your final plan in place, because you know that these actions will always be part of your final plan. And I think it would be quite good to pull those actions out, identify them now, and I'd like to see them being worked on and presumably be items in the next budget cycle and the next long-term plan. I would hate us to wait to 2026 for the final establishment of the plan to have any of the executions done. I would like to see some of the executions done before then, and then that with the anticipation that they would be compatible with the plan that comes out in 2026. Thank you.
Mr Mayor.
I agree entirely with the Chief of Infrastructure Committee. And in line with the question I asked, I think we need to have a very clear list of actions that we will be doing, projects and activities to do with flood protection in South Dunedin over the next few years, and not waiting to 2026. I think it'd be good to have a clear pathway and a clear, I suppose, assessment of where we sit right now in terms of protection against another flood of the magnitude of 2015. Because I think, that is the history, and we've had a bigger one earlier than that. So we just need to be really clear that we've got that covered. And of course, the long-term plan, the whole South Dunedin future plan, is for larger events further and perhaps more repeated, but into the future and up to 100 years away, which is entirely fair enough. And doing a lot of thinking and discussing and planning and community engagement prior to taking those larger courses of action is fine. But in the interim, we need to have that immediate protection so that the people who are there right now have a good level of peace of mind. And I think that's just entirely, as Councillor O'Malley has just pointed out, there's a balance between action now and long-term planning and a bigger, huger, much larger action in the future. I think there are still plenty of smaller things that can take place right now to give us that 2015 level of confidence. So I'd like to see that list that was talked about, that I asked about, and is there, and make sure that we're doing sufficient to give ourselves improving protection over the next 3 years.
Councillor Gilbert, then Councillor Houlihan.
Thank you. During all of this, first of all, this is a very sobering report, although ironically I had the overwhelming urge to pour myself a hefty scotch whilst reading it. But whilst reading it, I couldn't stop thinking of a presentation a few of the councillors got to see a couple of weeks ago in Christchurch around a place called Grantham in Australia that had a major flood in 2011. 19 people unfortunately lost their lives during that, but it was at that time that everybody had a wake-up call. And I am not even vaguely suggesting we're about to have that sort of an event in South Dunedin, but it got me thinking about that, and I believe it was one of the people on the panel who used the phrase, "Don't let perfect be the enemy of good." And I worry that if we take too long to do things, hence my questions on pace, because if we take too long aiming for perfect, that we'll miss the mark because we could have been at least good, if not great, in pursuit of perfect. And the other thing that became very clear whilst listening to that presentation was that communication and community are key. That making sure, as we have been, clearly having open communication with the community is one thing and it's vital, but so too is having the community lead the way, because it is going to be the community that is needing to live there. It's going to be the community that listens to themselves, and having local government, whether it's us, whether it's ORC, or in fact even central government, telling you what to do is completely different to leading the way yourself and being in control of your own destiny, informed control of your own destiny. So, I agree again, as Councillor O'Malley normally does, puts it rather succinctly and rather bluntly. We need to make sure we do look to the now and do as much as we can now, bearing in mind that the costs of not doing something may outweigh the costs of doing something now, if that makes any sense at all.
Councillor Hurley.
Thank you. Yes, I heard that speaker as well, and it was pretty impressive, actually, the speed that things happen. But of course, their scenario was completely different to what we have in South Dunedin, because this was a smallish town in Australia, and a lot of people were displaced. The horrors that we are concerned about had happened, and the people couldn't go back to their homes, and so they had to think of something else, and very, very quickly. And this one guy who spoke to the conference, said, well, they got a large amount of money from government, and that meant they could actually do things, and they then put all these people and created, I suppose, a small town, and the people had a lot of say in what happened, and it happened very, very quickly. So we have the opportunity here that we can plan, and at the moment, and we've got the good work of Jonathan, isn't it? Jonathan, sorry, and Ian and the teams that are working. One of the problems here, well, there's many, but is that there are so many different stakeholder groups involved, and that's whenever we've had that in other areas in the city, it does become a little bit difficult. But the groups are obviously all coming together with lots of different information, and everybody has their own area of work. From today, and listening to and hearing some of the questions and some of the answers, it is a concern that there's still some areas that are weak in our infrastructure that will be a pressure point if we have large floods again. That's inevitable in any part of the city, I suppose. But we are planning for a better future for South Dunedin, and I think that can only be positive. So onward and upward, and thank you to the work that's being done. There are so many groups involved here, but the government really, at the end of the day, has to be the big player that steps up, because they've got the dollars. Well, if they haven't, they've got to find them, because in an emergency we will need them. But when we're planning now, and if the truth is that the research and the science and all the other things show that this area is going to be a problem area in the future, then we need to plan for that, and that costs money. So here's hoping that the government doesn't forget South Dunedin and our city, and put some money in for that. And one of the ways that they talked about before is buying, as houses come up, the natural attrition, that they look at maybe buying some of those. That's an option. But certainly, I don't think we need to panic, but I think we do, as everybody else has said, need action sooner rather than later.
Thank you. I just want to make a comment that I'm very pleased to see this South Dunedin Future Programme come before us, and the reason that I asked about are we measuring the effectiveness of the comms and engagement is because of our a lot of the people that we meet from South Dunedin, their number one fear is the fear of the floods. They remember 2015 and they are petrified. So it is our job to instill confidence in them that we are committed to South Dunedin and that we have a plan and that they are not going to get flooded out again, because that is what they're worried about. In the end, this is about people, and a number of us were at the LGNZ conference, and the advice that we got there was engage, make voluntary, not mandatory. Things change and we start to evolve with our future. So we have the adaptive pathway, which, you know, we are getting frustrated. We don't have an answer, but we're working to get all of the science and all of the options in place so that then we will have a number of answers. And the other one, you guys are in this because you give a bleep. And that's about us, because we are also connected to the community. And many people here have asked about whether we're asking various groups, and it's also on us to connect them back to our South Dunedin community. There was also another comment, people want certainty about uncertainty, and I think it went on about lots of certainties and uncertainties, but that is what we are grappling with as leaders of the city, and this is a really complicated program that we've put a lot of investment in, so it's really important to us to keep getting those good messages through to South Dunedin and tell them that we are committed and working hard. This is one of our key plans. Councillor Gary.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just want to touch on a couple of points. One of them is that we're following the dynamic adaptive pathways planning, which is best practice according to the Ministry of the Environment. And it's not a process that is fast. It is a process that takes time and takes the community with us. And so we need to acknowledge that, but it will allow us to make evidence-based decisions, and that is important. We all learned a great deal from the 2015 flood, and we've heard about the work that's been done as a result of that and the learnings that occurred. But I certainly have noticed a change around this table over many years since then, and in terms of climate change and the impact. And I believe in the community there's been a massive change as well. As we hear about global events, catastrophic global events like the wildfires in Hawaii, like the heat waves, the floods in other countries, the devastating impact of climate change is here, it's now, it's not in the future, and it's probably the speed of it has surprised many of us in the community actually. And so this is a time to not rush forward and have a knee-jerk reaction, but to hold our nerve, be bold when it comes to making decisions, and make damn sure we base them on evidence and continue to engage with the community. And I know that is something that we are doing. I think around this table we all need to reflect about how we describe this situation, because repeating the idea of retreat is not helpful at all. We need to change our narrative as we navigate this. I think that's really important. And we also need to recognise that we can't guarantee, because this is a time of great uncertainty with climate change, but we can do our very best to plan for that uncertainty. And we also need to remember, when it comes to the time as we are approaching to look at the long-term plan, we will be called on to make investment. And so that's when the rubber meets the road around this council table. And I want to acknowledge work of staff over a very long period, very positive, proactive engagement with the community. I've witnessed it over a number of years, and it has certainly had a positive impact.
Councillor Wiley.
Thank you. Yeah, I concur with Councillor Gary about the words of not using the words retreat in regards to South Dunedin. Yet that was one of the first things that did come out a few days after the South Dunedin flood, which was quite sad. The key that I'm looking at as I read through the report was really focused on the contracting of a consultant group comprising of Engineering, Planning and Environment Services, WSP, Becker, Tonkin and Taylor, to support the delivery of the South Dunedin Futures program over the next 3 years. Because that tells me that we are actually going around and capturing as many minds and knowledge as we can. Combine that with GNS, The ORC is working with the university, and also we saw the school surveying mentioned. It's getting a wider approach to the future of South Dunedin, and also there is funding coming from government. In our financial consideration, we talk about a 507,000 per annum from council, 420,000 per annum from ORC, and additional grant funding of 1.45 million from government through Department of Internal Affairs Better Off allocation. So I thank government for stepping up on that basis. But Mr. Rowe, thank you for the work you're doing in the space. And I think the words that I've really picked out from today is actually council needs to maintain being proactive. There needs to be a positive future for South Dunedin, but continued engagement and looking at the future with similar ideas, but also with adding in different thinking. We have to be open to all opportunities for South Dunedin because it does have a future.
Councillor O'Malley, your right of reply.
Madam Chair. First, I want to start out in noting that a number of councillors acknowledged the work of the SDF team and the good job that they've been doing engaging with the community, and I can definitely say it's night and day from what it was in 2016. And I want to really congratulate the team on that. And I'm also confident that the planning work, which has been described here, is well structured and will come up with a good outcome. And we can't get the government money we keep talking about without that work in the background, because it doesn't come without well-structured reasoning for why it's needed to be spent. So I'm completely supportive of everything that we're doing, and I think so is everybody in the room. But my commentary I said in my first part of the speech and my questions reminds me back of, I kind of want to give a sense of a place I've been when I worked at Pfizer in drug discovery and how you had to deal with investment and uncertainty. When we were starting a new drug, they gave us $10 million in 5 years, and they said in 5 years' time, you need to come up with a prototype. And then they would commit themselves to $200 million in another 10 years' time, and in 15 years' time, they had a new drug. We're at the 18-year mark from the 2015 flood, and we still don't have any actual active work. 8 years. Sorry, 8 years. 8 years from there, but we don't have any active work done. Now, what I'd say is that it's been an observation of mine that there is a cultural tendency inside the council to be risk adverse. And we plan, and we plan, and then we plan again. And I just think I'm very conscious of what this team is doing, and I'm very conscious of the fact that we need to plan well, but we need to be absolutely certain that come 2026, the planning phase is going to be over, largely, and that we are genuinely committed to actual work by 2026. And I don't think I'll be sitting at this seat in 2026, but I will be definitely coming to the public forum to see where we are at the time, because I congratulate the team with what they're doing. I'm only saying one thing. I would tolerate a mistake of overinvestment at this point if I thought it was giving surety and comfort to the people of South Dunedin. That's not the same as reactive and dull investment. This is basically saying until we get this landed, we might want to put in this level of safety investment as we go through this. And I think we need to consider that as well. But generally speaking, this report has been well received by the council, and I think for good reason. It is a good report. There is good progress, and thank you very much, and keep it up. Thank you.
Right, I'm going to put the motion. All those in favour say aye.
Aye.
Anyone against? Abstentions? I declare the motion is carried. Move on to items for consideration by the Chair. Does anyone have any items? No, I shall close with a karakia. Kia whakaerea te tapu kia wātia ai te ara, kia turuki whakataha ai, kia turuki whakataha ai, haumie huie taike. Restrictions are moved aside so the pathways are clear to return to everyday activities. Thank you. I declare the meeting closed at 2:20.